It is my great honor to introduce Steve Bright, who will present our final award, the 8th Annual Norman Redlich Award for Distinguished Service and Continuing Lifetime Commitment to Capital Defense. We have the privilege of having Steve present the inaugural Norman Redlich Distinguished Service Award in 2012, and we are thrilled to have him join us again today. As President and Executive Director of the Southern Center for Human Rights for 34 years, Steve built the Southern Center into one of the nation's leading organizations representing those facing the death penalty and advocating for a day, as Steve says, when defendants will die on God's time, not the state's time. Steve has been one of the key central leaders of the national fight against the death penalty and for proper representation of capital defendants. He has also spearheaded or collaborated on many of the other important fights on behalf of victims of injustice, including unconstitutional prison conditions, racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, indigent defense, judicial independence, and alternatives to incarceration. Very few lawyers in this area have litigated as many cases from trial to the Supreme Court, including arguing and winning 4 landmark cases in the High Court, most recently in 2016 and 2017. In 3 of those cases, the Supreme Court found racial discrimination in jury selection and reversed the conviction and death sentence in each case. Steve has recruited and trained several generations of lawyers in this field, notably including Bryan Stevenson, who started his career in 1984 at the Southern Center, and today's honoree, Bernard Harcourt, who started his career at the Southern Center in 1989. Steve collaborated from the earliest days with many of the major figures in this cause, people like Barry Scheck, George Kendall, Kevin Doyle in the back, Ron Tabak, Eric Friedman, and Clive Stafford Smith, who leads Reprieve in the UK. Just to name a few. Today, Steve is on the faculty of the Yale Law School, Georgetown University Law Center, and Georgia State University College of Law. When you consider the lives that Steve has saved, together with the work of all those lawyers that Steve has recruited, mentored, inspired, and collaborated with, there may be no one in modern times who has helped to spare more defendants than Steve Bright. The students at Yale Law School have selected Steve 4 times to deliver their graduation speech. Those speeches all espouse a view that Steve shared with Norman Redlich, that dedicating yourself to helping others is no sacrifice at all. Rather, it is one of life's most fulfilling privileges. George Kendall once introduced Steve by saying that there was capital defense before Steve Bright and there's capital defense since Steve Bright. We can hope that thanks to his efforts and influence on others, that one day there won't be a need for capital defense in this country, in part because of Steve Bright. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, and hello, everybody. As I tell my students, when we got a lot to cover and not much time, we're going to the races, okay? I want to say what an honor it is to be here tonight to give this award. I gave the first one to Kevin Doyle, the inaugural award. He's here tonight. Great lawyer in Alabama and elsewhere in the death penalty, including here. But tonight, my friend, my colleague, my co-counsel, and at times my co-conspirator, Bernard Harcourt, my dear friend for the last 30 years. I met Bernard in January of 1989. He was a student at Harvard Law School, and he came to spend the month of January at the Southern Center for Human Rights. Just a few years earlier, Bryan Stevenson had come to spend the month at the Southern Center, the month of January. And that worked out pretty well. And now Bernard came, and remarkably, just a few years later, he would be with Bryan Stevenson at the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. He's been representing people in capital cases ever since, which is why we're recognizing him here, while we are recognizing him here this evening. There's certainly not enough time to talk about all the clients and all the cases. He was co-counsel with Bryan and Walter McMillan's case, the case of a man who was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death in Alabama, ultimately exonerated by the great work that Bernard and Bryan did, soon to become a major motion picture, Just Mercy, which will be released in December and January. He was counsel in many other cases, some with me, We also did have some other projects. We opposed the nomination of Ed Carnes to the 11th Circuit. Didn't work out well, but the High Court of History will vindicate us with regard to that. I want to just say a word or two about two cases that Bernard took in 1990 when he first went to Alabama, first went to Montgomery, and it just, I think, illustrates the great work that he's done. Representing those two people for 30 years, but at the same time teaching at law schools at Arizona, University of Chicago, here at Columbia, writing 8 books, teaching in France, teaching undergraduate courses. And even as he and Mia Ryder had 2 wonderful children, one of whom is here, Leo, one of whom was in my class at Yale Law School this past semester. How remarkable that I met Bernard in 1989 and had his daughter in my class just this last year. This is his family being here tonight. And Mia's being honored just a little later tonight with regard to her book, a chapter in the book Bridging Communities through Socially Engaged Art, which she's been involved in as well. Philip Wayne Tomlin was convicted in Mobile, Alabama, sentenced to life actually by the jury, but as Alabama law allowed at that time, the judge overrode the jury and imposed the death penalty. The judge was a judge named Farrell McRae, an old-time racist hanging judge who ran for re-election and advertised in his television advertisements all the overrides and all the death penalties he had imposed in his very undistinguished career as a judge. Bernard won a reversal of that case due to prosecutorial misconduct in 1981, and the case went to trial a second time, and he got 2 lawyers who were reputed to be among the best lawyers, the best criminal lawyers in Mobile to help him try the case the second time. These lawyers were horrible. I can tell you that because I was there. And I remember telling Bernard, if you can get this case reversed again, I'll try the case with you next time. And of course, that's just what Bernard did. He briefed it up, and he got the case reversed another time. And we go back for a trial, and we meet, and we co-counsel the case, and now I'm on the case. We're going to do much better. Actually, no. Once again, Mr. Tomlin is convicted. Once again, the judge overrode. I remember telling Judge Thomas right after he announced that Phil Tomlin had been sentenced to death despite a unanimous jury recommendation of life, saying to the judge, may God have mercy on your soul. But Bernard represented him in yet another appeal, another trip to the Alabama Supreme Court, and this time convinced the court to override the override and impose a sentence of life without parole. And ever since then, Bernard has been challenging the life without parole sentence. He just recently filed papers in the 11th Circuit on that. He was equally persistent in the other case I want to talk about for a minute, Doyle Lee Ham. He challenged his conviction in the state courts and state post-conviction. He challenged it in the federal courts all the way to the 11th Circuit and cert to the Supreme Court. And most recently, just last year, he challenged lethal injection in Doyle Ham's case. Doyle Ham, by the time Alabama got around to trying to execute him last year, Doyle Ham was 61 years old. He was suffering from lymphatic and cranial cancer, and he was undergoing treatment with radiation and medicine for his cancer. He was about to have surgery to remove a cancerous lesion from his cheek, but instead of surgery, Alabama set an execution date and planned to execute him. Bernard challenged that. He presented testimony that because of his cancer, because of his medication, because of his history, there was no accessible vein in order to kill him. Temporarily, a judge stayed the execution, ultimately vacated the stay. Bernard wrote in the New York Times that the litigation about lethal injection had descended into what he called a ghoulish inferno, a dreadful place where judges ruminate over catheter gauges and needle sizes and ponder whether to slice deep into the groin or to puncture the jugular vein. His application to the Supreme Court for a stay of execution drew a dissent from Justice Ginsburg, joined by Justice Sotomayor, and a statement by Justice Breyer reiterating his call for to declare the death penalty unconstitutional. Bernard was proven right last year on February 22nd, when the state of Alabama's people spent 2.5 hours attempting to insert needles all over Doyle Hamm's body, and were never able to do it. He was one of the very few people who've gone into an execution chamber for the purpose of execution and walked out alive that same night. Bernard's comment that night was, "This has been a bit of butchery that can only be described as torture." And indeed it was. He later reached a settlement with the Alabama Attorney General in which Alabama agreed not to seek another execution date, and since then he's been persistent in making sure that Doyle Hamm has gotten the medical treatment for his cancer that he needs. Bernard's persistence, his extraordinary advocacy, his eloquence, not only in the courts, but in the court of public opinion, is a lifetime commitment to this work that we recognize here with this award this evening. Bernard.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. On this dark day, with a U.S. Department of Justice that resembles more the evil ministry of Rawlings than anything that could be or have the word justice in it, in the shadow of this new dark federal cloud, the death penalty, and the 5 death penalties that Barr is seeking, it's particularly warming to be together as a community. As I look around the room, I see real giants who have dedicated their lives, their entire lives, to serving the poor and the most vulnerable on death rows around the country, and who've done truly God's work, and who inspired me, nurtured me, and so many others to do the little that I have done. Steve, you were the first, and literally opened your home and your sofa to me in January 1989. Kevin Doyle, who I worked with down in Alabama, and who became the capital defender for the state of New York here, a true inspiration, particularly in Birmingham. Brett Dingham, who's doing post-conviction work here. Alexis Hogue, who's been doing death penalty work for a decade down in Tennessee and now at the Legal Defense Fund. So many of you, so many, Eric Friedman and Geraldine Downey and all of you, Norman Green and everyone who's participated in this, and Greg Camp and Kate McMahon and Barry Scheck, to see you and to be surrounded by you today, women and men who have so dedicated your lives to trying to protect us and to protect this country and our society from our own worst instincts. Being with you is really humbling. I only wish that the women and men who we fight for could be more part of this celebration, but I know that they are. One of the differences with capital work compared to other kinds of work is that your clients don't come back. They don't reintegrate. They can't become justice and education scholars at Columbia and share their stories and experiences with us. But it's only a physical separation. And one thing I know and have felt so much is how my friends and clients on death row value this community, value our work, and how meaningful, life-saving, and life-sustaining it is to have this group here with them. Now, as I transitioned into academia, in part, I also was blessed to discover a whole new community and a whole new group of inspiring people, colleagues, but especially students, public-spirited students, public-interested students. And today, It's my brilliant and combative students who inspire me the most. Many of them are in this room, and I'm really glad that you could come. But it's your example, your service, your work, your initiative that inspires the rest of us. In my last Alabama litigation, I was joined by a team of law students and undergraduates who were constantly dedicating themselves. Nika Cohen, Phoebe Wolf, Jindu Obiofuma, who's here, Jindu, who did amazing work on the case, and Michael Castle and Gregory Bernstein and Benedict Bernstein and Laura Barron and Aegon and Isadora and Anna Krautheimer, and still now actively working with other students, Ashwini Velchami and Guylaine, our general, and the undergraduates who are here, Kiana Tagavi and Anissa Ayub, and I see Athena Oblong and others. Some of whom are down in Tennessee working where Alexis worked, Fonde Shen. To be surrounded by so many amazing and inspiring young women and men who are so dedicated is what really keeps me going now. And Leo, who was volunteering out at Rikers Island this year. It's you who inspire us and keep our faith going, since you will be leading us forward towards a better society. I wanted to quickly thank just a few people. So, in helping me juggle this public interest with scholarship, I really wanted to thank my dean, Jillian Lester, and Vice President and Dean Maya Tolstoy, who's here as well. Thanks. And Dean Susan Chang and Lisa Hollaboff and Jim McMenamin and Beth Manchester and Jennifer Smith, who all help us bring together the academic aspirations and the public interest aspirations. And also all my colleagues here, Olity Johnson and Bert Wang and Noah Smith-Drellick, who were doing a case in South Dakota on Standing Rock with, et cetera. There's so many of you here, and it's the community that matters. There are two people especially, though, I wanted to thank, and maybe I could bring up here. One of them is Dr. Mark Heath. Mark, come on, get up here. Come on, Mark. Mark, who's an anesthesiologist at Columbia Medical School, an extraordinary anesthesiologist, and worked with me very closely, advised me, gave me expertise throughout 2017, 2018, traveled with me to Alabama, went into the prison. I put on a special tie for you tonight. Is
that the one?
That's the one. And really, all of it pro bono, never asked for a cent, and just, was giving expert advice at every step, and without whom I would have been lost. Also, there are many others, but Jennifer Gonnerman, Jennifer, you want to come up also, from the New Yorker magazine, who was instrumental in thinking through a lot of, and helping get the story out. Now, I can't publicly say anything about the last case I worked on, so I'm going to cede the 2 last minutes with an informal approval from Greg. I'm going to cede the last 2 minutes of my 5 minutes to Jennifer Gonnerman, with deep gratitude for all of you. And
if I could just say one thing, I guess Bernard can't talk about the case because of your settlement agreement.
yes.
But I can. Right? He probably can't say. I just want to explain the tie. The first time I think we went down to visit Doyle Ham, Bernard and I had spent a lot of time on the phone talking about all the equipment that I would need to do a proper medical exam, especially to assess his veins. And when we got to the prison, we were not allowed to bring anything in. They went through our bags and wouldn't let us take anything in at all. But in order to assess Mr. Ham's veins, I needed a tourniquet to put around his arms to make them distend and see what was there. Thus the tie.
Jennifer Gonnerman, just I'll cede my last minute.
Last 30 seconds here. Well,
you've already closer to the mic.
Okay. You've already heard quite a bit about Doyle Lee Ham, but I just wanted to add a few details since Bernard can't talk about the case. But The execution was set for February of 2018, and that night, Bernard found himself in a van outside the prison with one of Doyle Lee Hamm's brothers waiting for the execution, waiting to be allowed in once a vein had been found and the lethal injection was about to start. And he sat out there for hours, waiting 2.5 hours, before finally someone comes out and tells him that the execution has been canceled. So in the end, Bernard not only saved the life of his client, but he also used this case and the horrific botched execution as a teachable moment for the entire country, getting Doyle's story out in the press, in the New York Times and elsewhere, so the torture that Doyle Lee Hamm endured, the 2.5 hours of poking and prodding, would not be covered up in any way. And I wrote about and had the pleasure of meeting Bernard 3 years ago, writing about his client. And back then, this is going back to 2016, when I spoke to Doyle Lee Hamm on the phone, he told me if I hadn't had Bernard, I believe I would have been executed. I would have been executed 10 years ago. And at that point, I remember Bernard telling me, whatever happens here with this case, Doyle Lee Hamm will not go quietly. And indeed, he did not. And in the end, after nearly 30-year fight, both he and Bernard prevailed.
Get a photograph. So thanks so much to all our speakers and awardees for such an inspiring afternoon. One very brief announcement, all members of the committee, all awardees, all speakers, if they could just come up right as soon as I'm finished in a second to get a photograph. And then the cocktail party will continue, and we hope you'll remain and celebrate with us as long as you can. I'd like to take a brief moment to remember my former boss, Robert Morgenthau, who died on Sunday just shy of his 100th birthday. The boss, as we all called him, was one of New York's and America's leading voices against capital punishment. Not once in his 36 years as Manhattan DA did he seek the death penalty. His testimony to the State Assembly, arranged by this committee and this Bar Association in that very room, helped to ensure that the death penalty was not restored in New York in 2007. Today, 21 states have abolished capital punishment, but there is still a death penalty in 29 states. And the federal system. And as we've discussed, we were all disturbed to learn today that the federal government intends to resume executions for the first time in 16 years. And that's why we need your help representing death row clients. That's why we need lawyers like the ones you've heard from this afternoon fighting every execution. And that's why we need voices as prominent as many in this room standing firmly against capital punishment. Thanks so much to each of you for being here. We hope to see you back here for future capital punishment programs. Please have a drink.